Hey, everybody. Welcome to Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival. I'm Julia Flynn Seiler, a Litquake board member, and we are streaming live from the Bay Area and around the world. Our festival runs from October 8th through 24th, right here at litquake.org. Check us out. Tonight, we are honored to be able to present Telling True Stories, Trials by Fire, with Dani Anguiano, Alastair, Scott James, and Frances Dinkelspiel. As California seeks to recover from yet another horrific summer of smoke and ash, Litquake offers two compelling nonfiction accounts about fire, both from Bay Area authors. Fire in Paradise, An American Tragedy, by Guardian journalists Alastair and Dani Anguiano, details the disaster which occurred on November 8th, 2008, when the Paradise, California community of 27,000 people was swallowed by the ferocious campfire, razing virtually every home and killing at least 85 people. We're also proud to feature a brand new book by New York Times journalist Scott James about the notorious 2003 Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island. Trial by Fire, a devastating tragedy, 100 lives lost, and a 15-year search for truth. Investigates the fire's origin, interviews key figures, and explores the local authorities' rush to judgment about what really happened. Appearing tonight will be Dani Anguiano, who is the co-author of Fire in Paradise, An American Tragedy. She writes for The Guardian and was a reporter for the Chico Enterprise Record. Her co-author is Alastair, an award-winning author and reporter at The Guardian, who has also written for The New Yorker Online, The New York Times, and The Economist. Lives in New York City. Scott James is the best-selling author of the novels The Sower and Soma, finalist for the National Lambda Literary Award for debut fiction, under the pen name Kemble Scott. With his weekly San Francisco column for the New York Times, James broke stories that then drew coverage from other national and international media, including the New Yorker, the London Times, the Guardian, and many more. He's been honored with 3 Emmy Awards for his work in television news. Moderator Frances Dinkelspiel is an award-winning journalist and co-founder of the news site Berkeley Side, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and elsewhere. Her first book, Towers of Gold, How One Jewish Immigrant Named Isaias Hellman Created California, was a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller. And her second book was Tangled Vines, Greed, Murder, Obsession, and an Arsonist in the Vineyards of California. Her book is also about fire, and that's why she's the moderator here tonight. So, quick orders of business. Please feel free to ask the participants a question using the Q&A feature of the software. After the event, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey. These surveys are also essential to our efforts to keep the Lit Crawl free. Everybody, Lit Crawls on Saturday night. It's really, really great. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates. And you can also support the participants today by visiting your local independent online bookstore or find our Litquake bookshelf at bookshop.org. We also ask for your support of the Litquake organization to allow us to bring you these events largely for free. The Bay Area was already a precarious place for artists and arts nonprofits, and now things are even more difficult. If you believe in keeping literature a key component of San Francisco's cultural landscape, please consider dropping us a few dollars. Every little bit helps. We accept donations on Venmo at Litquake, on PayPal at info@litquake.org, or directly at litquake.org. So let's get on with our discussion. Please welcome Dani, Alastair, Scott, and Frances. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie, for that wonderful introduction and trying to set up the conversation that we're going to have tonight about fire, its destructiveness, what it can do to people's lives and how people recover from this. Most of us are speaking from California, and you may or may not know that the California fire season used to start around October 1st and go through the end of November. But now, because of climate change, it has been extended. And so far this year, there have been about 8,500 separate fires in California, and more than 4 million acres have burned in California. And that is the most acreage that has ever burned in modern history in California. So obviously, fire is on our mind here. And today we're going to be talking about two different kinds of destructive fires. One fire that lasted really, well, it killed 100 people in 90 seconds. Imagine that, in 90 seconds, about as much time as it takes to have a sip of water and think about something. And another fire that killed 85 people very, very quickly, but wasn't extinguished for another 17 days. And we're going to talk to the authors about why they were interested in writing about these fires and how they sort of approach their topics, and what have the impacts been about these fires. Have there changes been made? Are people any smarter about building nightclubs or about building houses in the wildfire urban interface, and those kind of things? So first, we're going to start with Alastair and Dani. And could you please tell us a little bit more about the Camp Fire, when it erupted, and what was so extraordinary about the path that fire took, and sort of the rapidity with which that fire happened?
Sure. So to give you a little bit of background, Paradise, located in Butte County, that's in a part of California that is quite used to experiencing wildfires. That's a regular part of life in that neck of the woods. But what happened on November 8th, 2018, was that it was a very windy couple days. It was still pretty warm, even though it was November. And a piece of PG&E equipment malfunctioned, and it sparked this wildfire that quickly grew out of control. It grew faster than firefighters could get a handle on it. And it overtook the area so quickly. It moved faster than fire scientists knew fire could move. And it basically rushed toward the town of Paradise. It burned through these sort of remote rural outposts, places like Polga and Concow, and it came to this town in the Sierra Nevadas called Paradise. It was a town of about 27,000 people, very suburban. Have your Taco Bell, you have your Kmart, you have the high school where football is the talk of the town. And it arrived early in the morning, just around 8 a.m., and it caught people completely unaware. They knew there was a risk for fire that week, but they didn't know it would come like that, and that it would sweep over the town in a way we've almost never seen. It arrived so quickly that essentially every single person in town needed to escape at once. And that's exactly what happened. Everyone who could took to the roads and tried to get out. Many didn't, but those who did manage to escape the roads were quickly overtaken by flames. And so everything about this fire was huge and nearly without precedent. And I think part of the reason why it drew our interest is not just as Northern California journalists, but I'm from that area. I grew up nearby. I had family and friends who lived there, and so it was very personal. And I knew right away that it was going to be worse than anything we'd ever seen there.
Alastair, can you say a little bit about the geography of Paradise and why there turned out to be such a bottleneck? Like, if this had happened maybe in Chico, it wouldn't have been as devastating. What was it about Paradise that made it such a destructive fire?
Well, the spine of the Sierra, as we all know, it goes from north to south pretty much through much of the state. And Paradise was perched on the western edge of it, about 1,000 to 2,000 feet in elevation. And it was on a little ridge overlooking the valley where Chico is and the Central Valley is. And just because of the particular geography of this little ridge that it was on, there weren't very many roads from Paradise down out of the foothills and into the valley. In fact, there were maybe just 3 or 4 roads that you would call roads, really. And the main road, Skyway, was only 2 lanes both ways, and as it happens, the town had undertaken a project several years before the fire to actually narrow Skyway for part of its length, because people weren't visiting downtown businesses enough, they thought. So maybe people should stop speeding through town and slow down. And so you had this situation where you had a town of 27,000 people crowding onto the road all the roads at once. And we spoke to an evacuation simulation expert, and he told us that you have to imagine it's like after a sports game. You have everyone leaving the stadium at once, and inevitably there will be gridlock. And he told us that, in fact, this wasn't a particular fault of Paradise. He said that no town or city in the US could evacuate immediately if everyone suddenly had to evacuate at once. It's just, there are too many people, too many roads wherever you are. And so that was the dilemma or the disaster that the people of Paradise found themselves facing on that morning.
Okay. So let's now shift to Rhode Island, to the town of Warwick, to an incident that took place a number of years ago. We're really fortunate that Scott James, whose book is just being published right now, has a video he'd like to show us that sort of gives a synopsis of what happened in Warwick. And after we see that, we'll talk to Scott a little bit more and then broaden our discussion.
Well, thank you, Francis. So we're going to go back to 2003 to West Warwick, Rhode Island. And I think people will see the similarities. I'm fascinated by the Paradise Fire and also the similarities to what we're talking about here, even though on one way, on the surface, they seem like totally different things. A nightclub disaster and a wildfire. But let's take a look at the videotape and then we'll talk after.
It was a night like any other, a festive club filled with laughter and fun. But as we all know, it would be a night that would always be remembered.
February 20th, 2003. The aging rock band Jack Russell's Great White performed at The Station, a small roadside nightclub in the old New England mill town of West Warwick, Rhode Island. The show began with fireworks, 15-foot blasts in a club with 12-foot ceilings. A trickle of flame crawled up the wall. Moments later, columns of fire. In seconds, the stage and then the club became an inferno. 100 killed, hundreds hurt. The deadliest single building fire in modern American history, the nation's deadliest rock concert. As families mourned their dead and burn victims struggled to survive, the questions were overwhelming. Was this an accident or a crime? The nightclub had passed government fire and safety inspections. Why did it go up like a torch? Jack Russell and Great White claimed they had permission for fireworks at their shows and had no clue they were dangerous. A federal investigation recreated the disaster in a lab and showed deadly black smoke took the lives of those inside just 90 seconds after the fire started. No time for everyone to escape. Were there too many in the club? In the panic, there was a stampede toward one exit, causing a bottleneck. Why not use the other 3 exits? The government pointed fingers and filed criminal charges, but those accused did not include Jack Russell and his bandmates. For survivors and families struggling to recover, there seemed to be no justice. And in the end, there were never any trials, not criminal, not civil. That meant the government's version of events was never vetted in court.
People think that the legal system is a search for the truth, and it is not.
It's a search for a result.
A result that left unanswered questions.
See, the story of the Station nightclub fire is the story of loss, but it is also the story of the triumph of the human spirit. First responders rushing to the scene, strangers risking their own lives to pull each other out of the smoke.
Now, a fuller explanation of what happened has emerged. Key figures have shared what they know for the first time. A story of people put through a crucible, of survivors, heroes, victims, villains, of a system that's supposed to be there to protect us.
So a couple additional points to make coming out of the video. First of all, the fire was caught on video from the inside. It just happened to be that when the band started playing, there was a local TV news crew that was there shooting a story about something completely different and happened to videotape the entire tragedy. So we know an awful lot about the moment by moment about this fire and what happened. The other part that is you want to know, because it goes to the reason like, why did I write this book, is that in Rhode Island, it's a very tiny state. It's hard to really describe it, but the population of Rhode Island is about the same as the population of San Francisco. And it seems like everybody there knows everybody else. And in fact, when the fire happened, it was said that everybody knew somebody who was there. And I grew up in that area. And so it turns out that I knew someone who was at that fire. I knew someone who was inside the fire, who was trapped in that fire, who was almost killed in that fire. But the twist was the person I knew later would be accused of killing all of those 100 people. So that also brought me to the story and wanting to find out what really happened.
So just to follow up on that, Scott, without giving away the whole trajectory of your book, can you tell people who are listening a little bit about why the fire happened and the central question that you tried to answer? Because my understanding in reading this book is, it happened in 2003. There has not really been a resolution of this situation. There's been no trials to try to resolve it. Things were settled out of court. And it seems like your book is offering up an explanation for the very, very first time. So can you tell us what happened and what you explored?
Well, very typically of the legal system these days, something like 97% of cases are settled by plea bargains. So the legal system in the United States is not the one we see on TV in episodes of Law and Order. In fact, going to trial is extremely rare. Most cases are plea bargains in some way or another. And the two defendants who are the central subjects of the book, or one of the central subjects of the book, were pressured to take a plea bargain just like most people in the United States legal system are. The question was, because it was not put in court, we didn't have evidence presented and then arguments about the evidence, whether or not what the government said was really 100% true. So now I go back after all these years and I try to convince these people, including the person I knew, was somebody I worked with, an employee of mine from 25 years ago, ended up being the person accused, one of the people accused in these 100 deaths. It took a long time to get him to agree to talk for a lot of different reasons, mostly because he felt that at the time of the tragedy, there was a rush to judgment and the media was complicit. He didn't really like the news media anymore. And here I come, a reporter, after all these years saying, hey, well, tell me your version of events. And that took a long time to convince him to do that. Eventually he did. Eventually he introduced me to his brother, who was also criminally charged in the case. And eventually they showed me the materials that they had for their defense, the defense that never happened. And it showed an alternative story, different than the one that the government presented. The reason that the nightclub burned and all those people were killed in 90 seconds is because, not just because of the fireworks setting the club ablaze, but because the club was filled with foam that was supposed to be there to soundproof. Now, soundproofing foam by law is supposed to be flame retardant, but the foam that they had in that club was not flame retardant. It was in fact packing foam, something you'd use like for sending shipments. And in fact, it's like solid gasoline. It's an accelerant. So when those fireworks hit that foam, it went up like a torch. And that's why people died within 90 seconds. The temperature inside that building got up to, in some parts, up to 1,400 degrees in little more than 30 seconds. Nobody had a chance to get out. And complicating matters was the fact that this was a rock show. So people were there to have a good time. And they see these flames start and they see the wall of fireworks. and they just think it's part of the show. And for a fair amount of time, people just stood there and looked at it, figuring it was a special effect. So they didn't have the fear of fire that you would think that you would say would be normal. And those 30 seconds were absolutely key in surviving or not surviving that fire.
So we were talking a little bit about this before the program began, the idea that, you know, we live in Western civilization for the most part, that we, you know, have a lot of our needs met. And so we don't have this, you know, flight response. And you're talking about that happening at the station nightclub. It seemed like that also happened in Paradise. Some people, you know, decided they were going to leave. Other people's decided they weren't going to leave. Dani and Alastair, can you tell us a little bit about some of the people that you interviewed and their family members about those sort of life and death decisions and why some people fled and some people decided to stay behind?
Sure. One of the things that's really interesting to me is in this part of California, I would say more so than most places, people actually understand the risk of fire quite well. It's a part of their lives. There is some fear built up there. But you also see the opposite thing develop, where because people are so used to seeing smoke on the horizon, I think it can sort of shield them from understanding the risk. And that's one of the things we saw there. So the day that the fire started, this former volunteer firefighter named John Sedgwick, he was 82. He decided that morning that he was going to stay and try to fight the fire. And he told his daughter to leave because he understood to some extent that it was quite dangerous. But he thought with his knowledge that he would be equipped to handle himself. And for the most part, and most of the day, that was true. He was able to help out-of-town firefighting crews as they tried to navigate these mountainous, narrow roads with their giant engines. He helped save his neighbors' homes and a historic firehouse. But ultimately what happened that night is that this fire wasn't like anything he or anyone else had seen before. And eventually it overtook him and it overtook several firefighters. The difference was that they were able to get away and he wasn't.
To add to what Dani says as well, this is a part of California where there was actually a higher percentage of people with disabilities. The population tended to be older as well. This was the part of California where if you were priced out of the Bay Area, as a lot of the people, as many people in Paradise were out of the Bay Area or other coastal cities, the more expensive parts of the state, Paradise was a place that you would go. And so as a result, there were people who were seniors there who were retiring. One man I spoke with, I spoke with his partner of 28 years. He'd had his leg amputated. He was dealing with disabilities. And so he was one of those that when the fire came, it wasn't a question of why didn't he leave? The question was for him was more, can I leave? And in fact, Andrew was his name. He wasn't able to leave. He had several phone calls from about the time the fire broke out at about 8 a.m. Until 11 a.m., 3 hours later, with his partner, Iris, with his brothers, with friends who were offering to come and get him. It just so turned out that they couldn't reach him because of the gridlock we described, and he was physically unable to get out of his house by himself. And unfortunately, that was how it ended for him. The phones were cut off. His brother could hear explosions in the background, and Andrew was waiting by his door for someone to come and rescue him.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. I'm wondering if we could talk about how you guys, in both books, both trace the path of the fire in order to be able to explain to readers what happened, and how you sort of approach the idea of fire as a character. And I'm not sure if I'm projecting on you, but these books are all about the flames and the erratic nature of them. And both these books describe the fires in many different ways, some of them almost beautiful ways in terms of what they look like. So maybe we can start with you, Scott, again. How did you reconstruct the path of the fire and what happened? And how did you think about writing about it to give readers information, but not making it so gruesome that they wouldn't want to go on?
Well, I think that's definitely a fine line because it is gruesome and it's hard to not think of it in those terms. I think one of the things about the nightclub fire that people might want to know is there's a very good chance, perhaps 100% chance, that the firefighters in your community, part of their training was to study this fire. It's probably one of the most studied fires in the United States history for a couple different reasons. Number one, it's on videotape, which is so unusual. And in 2003, this was before the iPhone was invented. There were no smartphones. Today, we're so used to everything being caught on video. Back then, nothing was caught on video. And this was a professional TV news crew that was there, that was doing the filming. So you can count the number of times a professional TV crew or video crew or film crew has caught a tragedy of this magnitude on film. You have the Hindenburg disaster, you have 9/11. Besides that, that's how rare it is. So we actually have a second by second accounting of this fire that federal investigators could take and then analyze and really put together what exactly happened in this fire. And it's used for training today in investigations of fire and in training on how to control fires and respond to fires. But it was, it was one of those things that was, you had to be very careful because not only did so many people perish, but so many people survived. They're highly traumatized by this and the memories of this, and they have distinct memories of what they saw inside that fire. And so while I wanted the reader to feel that and understand that, the gravity of it, at the same time, I tried not to go so far as to sicken people and turn them off, because you certainly could go there. And I am probably one of the few people who's actually seen the photographs from the aftermath of the fire that show the victims where they laid. Those are things that are not made public, but I was able to have access to them. And it's something you don't want to see. You really can't unsee it once you do. So I'm your filter to give you a version of the story that makes you go there as much as possible, but not so much that it hurts.
So Dani and Alastair, can you talk a little bit about how you created, the chronology of this fire? In Scott's book, it took place in one building. It was a very contained thing. In Paradise, there were embers flying, fire started here and then here and then here. Did you guys rely on 911 calls to sort of trace the path of the fire? How did you put together what actually happened that day?
Part of it, I would say a bulk of it was through these public records requests of poring over CAL FIRE documents. That certainly played a big role. They had a chronology of the fire that essentially is transcripts of their talks with each other, crews talking to each other. So that helped us get a sense of where the fire was and how it moved into town. We also combined that, with these 911 calls of people reporting where the fire was, that there was something burning in their backyard. And it was something that was quite shocking at the time, because if you listen to the 911 calls, the fire swept over Paradise so quickly that the dispatchers were in disbelief. They said, no, there is no fire in Paradise, because they were operating with the best, most current information that they had. And people were saying, no, there are flames in my backyard. So things get harrowing quite quickly. And that certainly played a role in mapping it out, as did, the individual accounts, the people we talked to. At one point I was making a map of where the people I interviewed were to try to understand how the fire moved through.
The fire behavior in this fire, what emerged from all of this was just this picture of this fire behaving in a way that firefighters describe as extreme. And these people are the pros, they're the veterans, and they would say things to us like, we've never seen a fire behave in the way that this did before. Dani referred before to the speed at which it moved. About 10-20 minutes after this fire first sparked, it was eating up about 400 football fields worth of vegetation a minute, and it was eating that up traveling in the direction of Paradise. And it had this behavior called spotting, which is essentially there's the main flame front, and a bit of leaf or bark or a pine cone that's on fire gets picked up, and the wind picks it up and flings it ahead of the main fire. And so it had this behavior where you had a lattice of little fires that were sparking ahead of the main body of the fire. And these little lattices, they were combining, and they were essentially making fire everywhere these firefighters looked. And part of the problem with Paradise's evacuation was that the emergency planners had planned for a fire that came from one particular direction, but they hadn't planned for a fire like this, which, because of this spotting behavior, was coming from several directions at once and cutting off several routes out of town at once. And so we're seeing this increasingly now in California wildfires. We're seeing fire tornadoes, we're seeing fires growing at speeds that people didn't think they were able to grow at. Just recently, we saw, we've seen fires of an extent, as you described, Francis, that are really historic. And so I think it's part and parcel of the conditions that are out there now with the forests, and also it's a result of climate change.
So there won't, it sounds like there's not going to be any sort of, normal fire in California in the coming, period of time. And we're in a drought, we're expecting a very dry season, and all the fires that are described that happened this year are catastrophic, like the Paradise Fire, which was an anomaly to some degree when it happened because it was so many people died. But now that's like every fire, and that is very disturbing. And do you feel like the Cal Fire, have they learned anything over the last couple of years? Were you able to talk to them about their different approaches to firefighting now?
Yeah, we spoke with the head of Cal Fire at the time, and he was the head of Cal Fire from about, I think, the early 2010s until just after the Camp Fire. And he described, and it's what you can witness as well in the descriptions of the various fires, that throughout that decade or so period, there was this steadily escalating drumbeat of fires that were worse and worse. There were the wine country fires that killed about 45 people. There was the fire tornado in Reading that was captured in camera and is so astonishing to see. And then there was the Camp Fire as well. And the firefighters recognize that something is going on. They will be the first to tell you that they are seeing fires. They are seeing what they call career fires, which is, a career fire. They used to say, this is the worst fire you see in your career, and you always talk about it as your career fire. They were seeing career fires every year. One of the firefighters we spoke to said, I've had 4 or 5 career fires in the last 3 or 4 years alone. So they're well aware that the conditions are changing. So they don't need convincing. I think where some of the difficulties are is, there's a global problem of climate change, and California is taking great action on it. It has excellent renewable energy goals and so on. There's only so much one state can do. There's also an issue of how we manage our forests. I mean, President Trump talks about forest management, and he's rightly mocked for the way he talks about it because it's frankly ridiculous. But there is at the core of his argument, there is truth to it, in that because we've been so successful with organizations like Cal Fire at putting out fires from the early 20th century onwards for the past 100 years, we're amazing at fire suppression. The result is that formerly you would have fires that cleaned out the forest undergrowth, they killed young trees, they made the forest less dense. And that would mean that on balance, you had less severe wildfires. This is going back hundreds of years now. And also in Native America, when Native Americans were the only people in California. Today, we have these forests that are artificially dense, they're anthropogenically dense. So you mix anthropogenic forests with anthropogenic climate change. And that is in large part why we're having these sorts of fires that we're having now.
So California does have a plan to do some controlled fires where they burn the underbrush, but I think it's like 1 million acres a year. Is it even realistic to think that we can sort of like improve the existing forests that we have? I mean, there's so many forests in California. We don't have the money or the people power, I would think, to go in and cut down and thin out some of that brush. You think it's possible?
It's a massive challenge, but I will say that in parts of the Southeast, in the state of Florida, for instance, they burn hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres a year. And we don't think of Florida as a state that burns, but sometimes patches of land there get burned more than once a year. And this is all prescribed fire, for reasons that, either we're doing it because we want to do it in Florida, but in California for various reasons, because of it increases pollution. Smoke is a pollutant, for reasons that there's a real jigsaw of land ownership, for reasons that we don't want these beautiful places that we love to burn. We think of fire as bad, when in fact it's natural. It has historically proven more complicated, but That's what fire scientists say. That's their one recommendation is they say, let's get fire back onto this landscape.
Okay, great. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the craft of the book, and maybe I'll go back to you, Scott. You know, people who don't know us fantastic journalists, you know, often look at us and think we're vulture-like because we want to go talk to survivors, and we often talk to people when they're still deeply in pain. But, you know, to uncover information, we need to do that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you approached writing your book. You selected a couple of specific people to follow very, very closely in the book. There were 100 people who died. Why did you choose to just really focus in on a handful? You do mention others, but you just sort of decided that the X number of people are going to be the people who are going to tell this story.
Well, I think you had to have the few who are going to represent the many. Because you're right, there's 100 people who died, a couple hundred hurt. The ripple effects go into the thousands in that little state. And each person's story is worthy of telling. So it's not a lack of compassion or interest. It's just for the ability to tell something in the form of a book where you want the reader to be able to connect with people, you have to personalize it. And so I needed to pick people who were willing to tell their stories in a very personal way so that the reader, whether they're in Kansas or Alaska or 20 years from now in Portugal, can read this story and say, okay, I'm with these people, I'm living with them, I'm seeing what they see. But in order to get that type of intimacy, I had to develop a certain type of reporting that was very intrusive and difficult. So what I would do is I would interview a person about a scene that was going to be in the book, and then I would write the scene. I'd write a draft of the scene, and then I'd go visit them a couple months later, and we'd do what's called a table read. I would do printouts of the scene, and the person would be there, and anyone else who was in the scene could also be there as well. And we'd go through every sentence, every line, every noun, every verb, because if I was going to make the argument that this book is being told through this person's eyes, then I'd better make sure it accurately represents what they were seeing and what they were thinking at the time. And
that's very unusual, though. Most journalists don't show their subjects what
Correct.
They've written about them.
Right. But this second round is when everything came up. It's when the memories came up that maybe were tangential to the story, but really were the things that allowed us to connect with the person as a human being. Mm-hmm. So perhaps I'd be interviewing you, Francis, and when I do the second round, you would remember something about your mother and your relationship with your mother. Well, I wouldn't have thought to ask you that because it wasn't on point to our subject. But now I have that information, and now I know something more about you as a human being, and I weave those very personal moments into the story, and I think that's why it connects with people. So in essence, this is a story of a handful of people from before, during, after this incredible tragedy. Ordinary people put through extraordinary things, and it's their story. And around that is where I do my journalism and where I reopen these facts and take a hard look at them and ask the difficult questions. But the essence of the story has to be about human beings, or else what's the point?
Mm-hmm. So I want to bring up one more question, and then we'll take some of the audience's questions. And that has to do with the whole question of blame. And maybe I'll stick with you, Scott, and then we'll go back to Dani and Alastair. You know, human beings want villains. Human beings want explanations. In tragedies, there isn't always one explanation. There isn't always a reason something awful happens. And I just wanted to ask your opinion about, you know, if in Rhode Island, is there someone to blame? What sort of, what complexity of things came together to make that fire happen? And do you think people who were involved in that fire feel like they have identified the culprit and they've been able to sort of come to, you know, put their blame there and maybe come to terms with it?
Well, look, I think that when all the facts are laid out for people and they get to read them all, they will come to their own conclusions. And I have no delusions. Some people will feel one way and some people will feel another way. But broadly speaking, I am concerned about this idea that we need scapegoats, that we need to blame people. I have a whole section of my book where I look at the need to criminalize accidents. So if something is an accident, we rush these days to criminalize it. And that has real implications for our safety as a community. the example I cite is the one involving the Boeing airplane that crashed. The two crashes a couple of years ago that happened with the 737. So between those two crashes, there was an investigation, but people didn't come forward perhaps the way they could have and be completely transparent about what their concerns were about the first crash, because we have criminalized accidents. And so, as I'm not just the person saying, there's experts who have studied this and said this. And as a result, then we have a second crash. And you see this played out again and again and again. People are not encouraged to come forward, put all their cards on the table after a tragedy because they're all running for their lawyers. And this has implications for our safety as a community because we don't know what's really going on. So this book, by the time this book is published, it'll be more than 17 years since this fire happened. And only now will some people be hearing parts of the story. And part of that was because of this incredible rush to judgment. On the night of the fire, the chief law enforcement officer for the town where this fire happened decided and announced who was guilty. But before the investigation had even really started, before they even understood that there was deadly foam, all they knew was that there was a fire and there were a lot of people dead. And he went to the Associated Press and said who he felt was guilty without having done the investigation. So there's a problem with that. As a result of that, people stopped talking. They stopped being cooperative. They did not share with the authorities what they knew. They did not offer their sets of facts. They were essentially silenced until now. There's a whole domino effect that happened as a result of that. So this rush to judgment, the need to to criminalize accidents, the need to find scapegoats has real implications for our safety. There's a direct line in my mind between what happened in Rhode Island and what happened in Oakland with the ghost ship fire. The sets of facts are different, but overall, these are buildings that were not properly inspected, that were not properly looked after by the government systems that we think are there to protect us from death trap buildings. But in each case, we see that that is really not the case. And I do wonder that if things had landed differently in the Rhode Island case, if we would have had a ghost ship fire in Oakland.
Okay, thank you. So Dani and Alastair, Dani, you mentioned in the beginning that the campfire was sparked by a malfunction in a PG&E tower, I gather. And I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about PG&E right now. Obviously, it's being blamed for a number of fires in, I don't know who that is, sorry, a number of fires throughout California. And, you know, it has done good work. You know, it has said it's stepped up. It's doing these inspections. It's trying better. It's cutting off power to communities when there's wind coming up. Can you talk a little bit about, do you think, you know, it's just all PG&E's fault, and if they'd done better, this wouldn't have happened? Or are there other factors at play that people living in California need to think about?
Right. So it's quite clear what sparked this fire. It was clear pretty early on. A piece of equipment on a PG&E transmission line failed. It broke, and it sparked this massive fire. And what we would learn in the months after was that this particular tower, this piece of equipment, was almost 100 years old. It was older than, you know, the oldest people we talked to and wrote about in our book. It had been in that place on that tower since before they were born. And it needed to be replaced decades earlier. PG&E failed to do that. They didn't inspect it. For decades, it was a missed opportunity to prevent the cause of that particular fire. And so that we know for sure, PG&E has admitted to that. They have pled guilty to that. I think where it gets a little more nuanced and a little more complicated is the fact that we had a fire of this size in November when it should be cool, when we should be getting rain and wearing jackets. That gets to sort of the larger problem, which is the climate crisis in California. It's getting drier, it's getting hotter, and it's creating conditions that are ripe for these massive mega fires. So I think PG&E, you know, absolutely should be held to account for this fire, but we have to look at climate change and the changing conditions in California. Just about a month and a half ago, I was up in Butte County again reporting on another wildfire that killed 15 people, which is absolutely devastating and remarkable, and I think would have, made more of a splash had it not been for the campfire 2 years earlier. And that wasn't caused by PG&E that we know of. As far as we know, that was caused by a lightning strike. And so, the fact that we saw a fire of that size and we keep seeing them, there's a larger problem afoot at the same time.
So someone from the audience asked a question, which I think is a really good one. And I'd like, both you guys, all of you guys, to address it. Essentially, the question is, in the face of so much tragedy and having to write about so much tragedy, did you find moments of courage that stood out for you? Moments of human bravery, moments of human connection that sort of were inspiring.
Absolutely, that was a really big part of the book. We wanted to find, we were overwhelmed with stories of connection and kindness and of people helping one another and of acts of heroism as well. We talked about Cal Fire earlier. When you had 27,000 people in Paradise pouring out of town, Cal Fire was coming in, and there was one firefighter we spoke with. His name is Joe Kennedy, and he has an amazing story. He drove his bulldozer in on the back of his big rig truck. He drove it into the fire, got on his bulldozer, and he heard that some members of his crew were stuck. And not only were they stuck, but they'd taken in several civilians into the cab of their fire truck, and they had been hemmed in on all sides by burning cars, and the fire truck couldn't get out of there. And Joe Kennedy, he plowed away, dozens, perhaps 100 cars. Some of those cars had the bodies of victims in, but he got to that fire truck just as its paint was melting and the lights off the front were melting, and he was able to clear a path even as his own windscreen was cracking from the heat. It was filled with black smoke. He felt like he was burning, but he saved them. And there were so many stories that we heard like that. Another really touching story is not to do with humans, but to do with animals. We spoke to one guy named Jeff Evans, and after the fire, he was stuck behind the cordon, essentially, that authorities set up to stop people going in and out of town, because by that point, there were just lots of dead bodies in town, and they didn't want people disturbing it, so they could do the identification process. So this guy, Jeff, he lived in a town called Concow, and for the 3 weeks that he was stuck behind that cordon, he rescued animal after animal, and he brought them back to his own house. And at one point, I think there were a dozen dogs living inside his home with him. Outside, he had ducks and geese that were congregating by the side of the lake, and he would feed them. He rescued mules, he rescued pigs. And he said to me that amid all of that horror, having those dogs in his home, it had to be one of the most therapeutic things he could have done. And there were many stories like this. So I don't think Dani or I want to give the impression, although we want to commemorate and memorialize the victims, we also want to tell these beautiful stories of how people, in the face of tragedy, people pull together. It's a myth that disaster and earthquakes and so on, there's tension and there's conflict afterwards. What we found was really the opposite.
And I'm sure the man who saved the animals, and I know you said he posted things on Facebook and things like that, people must have just been, streaming to his page because we love animals and it's such a good thing, and people could really root for everybody. So
yeah, that's right.
How about you, Scott? Any particular?
One of the issues with this terrible tragedy is that you had a fire inspection system, a fire code system that failed horribly, and the place didn't have sprinklers and didn't need to have sprinklers, and so there were a lot of failures on that side of the fire protection table. However, firefighters ran into that burning building to save people, and they did save people, and some of the stories are unbelievable, the rescues that they performed. Additionally, there were club patrons who ran into the flames and kept running in and bringing people out until they didn't run back out because they were consumed by the fire themselves. So there were incredible acts of bravery like that are stunning. It's interesting because I follow certain people very closely. People talk about crying when they read the book, but they don't cry about the horror. They cry about the triumphs, because these people go through such an incredible ordeal after the fire. that when they finally survive or thrive or reach a certain moment, you can't help but feel completely overwhelmed by that. And that's when people get emotional. It's interesting. They don't get emotional when they read about the moment by moment tragedy. They get emotion when they read the triumph.
That's it. So another question from the audience has to do with, you know, as writers, the self-care that you had to do for yourselves. I mean, you're telling terribly sad stories. Did you find that you were able to cope? Were there moments you had to pull back? Did you have to take breaks? How did you continue going forward when you're writing about, you know, so much death and destruction?
For me, I think this is one of the areas where having a co-author was really helpful because, you know, after every difficult interview, and most of them were quite difficult, I would call Alastair and we would kind of debrief, and talking it through was really valuable to me because, you know, again, you're hearing people talk about the worst experiences of their lives. They're describing losing loved ones, of seeing their home and their town burned to the ground. And, you know, that combined with listening to some really awful 911 calls of people who didn't make it out of the fire and were calling for one last plea for help. It certainly wears on you, and you have to take breaks and step away to be good at the work and to keep doing the work. But I think for me, what it came down to was I really wanted to tell this story. I felt that, you know, as someone from the area, I needed to help tell this story. And so just trying to remember that mission helped me kind of pull through it, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, Scott, I know you've been thinking about this book for 10 years or at least. I mean, it's interesting. Both of you have, well, Dani and Scott, you have a personal connection to the geography of what happens, which certainly is a way to drive forward, you know, your decision to write a book about this. You know, Scott, you were there around, I think, when it happened, or you left just right before that. How did you sort of cope with the emotions about the fire, and how did you take care of yourself in a 10-year-long process where you are a very good reporter, you are a relentless reporter. I know you went after trying to get people to talk, I'm sure, many, many times, but that also is a draining thing to do. So
well, I lived in Rhode Island, but I was long gone from Rhode Island when this tragedy happened. I was living in California. I saw it on TV like a lot of people did because of that videotape and the scope, the size of the tragedy. And it's the deadliest single building fire of the modern era since the Beverly Hills Supper Club, when they changed all the fire codes and a lot fewer deadly fires happened. So this got a lot of attention because of the number of deaths, but then there was that video. So it was seen all over the place. But honestly, even though I knew somebody was in the fire, and when I found out the person had survived, of course I was like, well, that's good. And then I saw from a distance what had happened with that person then being accused of being basically one of the killers. So I did follow all of that, and I followed it from afar. And I really wasn't emotionally invested at that point. Only when I would go home and people would say, you know, I don't think there was ever justice in this case. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And then I started asking some questions. But honestly, Francis, you do cry. You'd be a terrible person to sit there and not have people cry during their interview and not be moved as a human being. So yeah, I think you do become emotionally invested, and you have those moments where you just have to kind of step back, take a breath, get your head together. But yeah, there's tears. I still cry when I read certain parts of the book, and I wrote the book because I'm back at that moment, at that kitchen table, hearing that story, and it all comes back to me too.
So Dani and Alastair, your book is seamless. It seems like it's written in one voice. It's really nicely written. Both these books, by the way, they're so well written. I read Scott's book in like 24 hours. I couldn't put down Dani and Alastair's book. So I hope everyone out there goes and gets a copy and reads these books. But Dani and Alastair, can you talk a little bit about co-writing a book, how it happens, how the mechanics of it?
Sure. Well, so Dani and I had worked together at The Guardian. And so initially the book came out of a long form article that we wrote together early on, maybe about a month after the fire, a month or two after the fire. And it was clear that just from that one story that we worked together really well. We basically, and this is how it worked for the book, we each decided that for maybe the first 3 or 4 months, we were just both going to go out there as much as possible and speak to as many people as we could. We ended up speaking to hundreds of people. And we each also assigned ourselves topic areas. So Dani took PG&E, I took climate change and forests and so on. And then when it came down to sit down and write, we each contributed our bits. We had an outline and we just plugged our bits in essentially. And then we both went through it together and just wrote through it essentially so that it felt like it was written in one voice. And we cut any edges off that made it feel like it was one or the other, because we really didn't want it to feel like it was two people writing. We wanted it to feel like we did have one voice. And that was how it essentially came together, is we brought our bits separately and then we intentionally made it sound like one person had written it.
So each person wrote a bit, and then would you sort of sit down together or over to sort of go through it? I mean, how do you even make it sound like one voice? Was there one primary person who did that for each chapter?
We each had topic areas that one of us was more of an expert in, but honestly, we did it together the whole time. And it's a really good question. You know, one of the longest phone calls, literally the longest phone call of my life, was with Dani, and it was when we were working one of the final drafts. We got on the phone at 10 p.m. one night, and we got off the phone at 7 a.m. the next morning because the next draft was due in. And that typified how we worked on the book. We just sat on the phone with each other and methodically went sentence to sentence to sentence. Does this work? Do we need to change this? How is this? And so I feel really grateful to have a co-author like Dani, because she's incredibly diligent, has a lot of grit, is extremely high standards of professionalism. And so, you know, for me, I don't know how I was to work with, but it was very easy to work with someone like Dani because we both wanted to get it right. And so, you know, we definitely had characters, for instance, that was more one character than the other. Dani's was Sky, for instance, I was with Iris. And so we would both say to each other, I think, you know, I have this question upon reading this bit you've just filed. And Dani would be like, yeah, that's a good question. Let me go back and ask Sky. And she would do the same for people that I had focused on, like Joe, for instance. She would say, I wonder more about this thing you wrote about. And so, you know, we both took direction from the other. And I think we were just lucky to have, at that very early stage in the process, not, you know, it was not by the time an editor had got to it, we were each other's editors very early on. And I think that really helped the process.
So I want to remind people who are listening to put questions in the Q&A, and so we can get to some more of them. Scott, back to you. I'm wondering if you're willing to share a little bit about your writing process, because it was very geographically dispersed. And I think you did a lot of things, from just my observation, to sort of help you focus at different points. And I think that's one of the challenges when you're writing a book. First of all, it involves a lot of work, but it's so easy to get distracted in your day-to-day lives. And in order to really write, you have to sort of focus in a very profound way. And getting that focus can be a challenge for authors.
Well, I think one of the things I always tell people is you have to go to work. So it's very hard to write in your home, surrounded by all your stuff and all of the distractions that have that. So I'm very fortunate. I belong to a writing community, the Castro Writers Cooperative, which is in the heart of the city, and it's a little cottage, and there's like 30 of us who belong, and that's where we go to write. And because that's where we go to write, when we go there, we write. It's almost like you're trained, it's Pavlovian. But you can do it anywhere. I know writers who go to cafes, and when they go to the cafe, that becomes their office. I'm sorry, pre-COVID, I should say, go to the cafe, that would be their office. So I think you do those things just to separate yourself from your regular life. You know, there's an expression, a mathematical equation, they call it the AC ratio. And AC is ass to chair. And you need to improve your AC.
It's scientific.
It's science, or else you can't get a project like this done. And this was sprawling. You know, to do this, they're not only the interviews, but for me, there were tens of thousands of pages of previously secret grand jury testimony that had to be considered, and probably millions upon millions of words of news coverage that happened at the time that I also had to cull through. I don't know if you remember microfilm. Microfilm. I've spent a lot of time in libraries scrolling through microfilm to see how newspapers covered the story in 2003, because it's in a weird time as far as electronic journalism is concerned. A lot of newspapers, their archives for those times are not readily accessible through their regular websites. Even if you're a subscriber, even if you pay a premium, the stories are not there. Besides, you want to see what was a front page story, 6-column headline versus what was on page B12 at the bottom. So there was a lot of that too. So you look, I think with a lot of these sprawling projects, probably the challenge for writers is not going down the rabbit hole of research so that you never come up. I mean, I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that I spent the better part of a year working on trying to find archives and material and genealogy stuff and church records related to this one red herring that I was chasing. There were many conspiracy theories about this fire, and I did check them out to find out if there was any truth to them, and they sent me on wild goose chases. I remember hiring a genealogist, an expert in genealogy, to go through records for months and months and months to try to prove some point that somebody had suggested to me that turned out not to be true. It's easy to spend a lot of time like that. This is why it took 10 years. Part of it was convincing people, but part of it was just checking everything out that I could.
So there is a question from someone in the audience asking, it did take 10 years for you. Was there ever a point you wanted to give up on the project?
I think, what's funny is sometimes you get into these emotional exchanges with the people that you're covering, and you do have those days when you're wondering, what in the world am I doing? Am I really causing harm by opening this can of worms, or picking at this scab, picking at this wound, that'd be better off if this person just never had met me? You certainly have those days. And then you think about, well, what am I doing this for? I mean, basically, I don't want people to forget what happened in 2003, because I think this was an incredible tragedy. Lessons should have been learned. I'm quite concerned that the lessons were not learned. And I'm going to reintroduce this story to people so that perhaps they will be learned now, because we're going to revisit this story in a very, I hope, an impactful way, so that people will talk about these issues. And I have to say, after reading the Paradise Fire book, I kind of felt the same way. I was just befuddled by some of the things that happened, and that I don't see real solutions happening there either since those fires. I don't see the change. I thought it was interesting. They talked about how we do these shutting off the power to prevent the lines from coming down and starting fire. But in fact, in Paradise, it would have made no difference, because the tower that caused the fire wasn't actually in Paradise. So it's fascinating that we're doing things now and we're wondering, okay, why are those really helping? These are really good questions we have to ask. These are systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Well, I think that gets to the whole question of blaming. And on the flip side of that is people have to take action. They feel they have to do something. It might not actually be particularly effective action, but we all want to make some changes. So it looks like we're trying. So Dani and Alastair, there's a question here that I think is good for you. Of course, I went to the wrong screen. What have you each personally taken away from telling these stories? Maybe Dani, you could start.
Sure. I think it's kind of a point that Alastair made earlier, which is how impressive and amazing it is that in times of crisis, the ways in which people pull together to help each other. I think that was one of the most uplifting parts of this project for me, was looking at, as I mentioned, someone like John Sedgwick, an 82-year-old who wanted to use his knowledge and experience to save and preserve the land that he loved. And he fought with all of his might to do that. And at the same time, his daughter, Sky, who only escaped because someone stopped, who didn't know her, someone stopped and picked her up and said, "You can't walk out of here, get in my car." I think those are the things that that have really stuck with me through this. But the other thing is that, we need massive systemic action to prevent fires like this. I think of the fire that we saw last month where, a 16-year-old boy was killed, and through no fault of his own other than being in the path of a fire that he didn't know was coming. And, we have to take action. I was talking to a fire scientist recently who told me how disheartened he was that after years of deadly fires, there doesn't seem to be anyone with the massive kind of groundbreaking action that we need. And so I hope we see that, and I hope it won't take another Paradise.
I think what I take away is a newfound understanding of the landscape of California, what makes California, California, its trees. California is a place like the entire American West pretty much that was built to burn. The trees have evolved to need fire to procreate. There are even species of flowers and shrubs that they grow better, and they respond to the presence of burned compounds, burned wood, and so on. So this is it's a part of the world that we love, but that needs fire in it. And historically, the people who lived here recognized that, set fires, understood that fire had a role here. And it's making me ask much broader questions about the future of forests, not just in the West, but in the world now. We're seeing lots of forest mortality, in large part through wildfire, and those forests aren't regrowing now, in part because the climatic conditions have shifted in such a way that these areas that they formerly grew in are now unsuitable. So for me, it's just opened my eyes to these vast ecological questions. And as Dani said, I just don't think we're grappling with them with our eyes open in the way that we should be grappling with them. California needs to be taking massive action to deal with fires and to head them off in the future, in the same way that I just don't think that we fully recognize the perils of the climate crisis we're facing. We still have our heads stuck in the sand, as it were.
That's for sure. So I'm wondering if you guys have any questions you'd like to ask one another.
Well, can I say something? Something I found fascinating in their book was because we talk about climate change. It was just a little fact, and I don't think I'm doing a spoiler here by bringing it up, but in World War II, by the time of World War II, 80% of California's electricity came from hydroelectric. So we were a greener state at the time of World War II than we are today. That kind of just blew my mind, that fact.
We have a lot more people.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, as it happens, California, basically the reason for that is that California didn't have coal, and much of the eastern US at the time of the gold rush was powered by coal. So when people came to California, electricity, the long distance transmission of electricity from hydroelectric dams in Sierra Nevada was what powered the state for much of the time that California was becoming California. I mean, the early movie studios, for instance, they were powered by hydroelectricity from the Sierra Nevada and other places. So California was a green state for so much of its history. A question that I had for you, Scott, is I was just curious, I would love to hear some of the stories that really lingered with you. I mean, maybe some of are there any stories of heroism, for instance, that particularly remained with you? What sticks in your mind when you think?
I'll tell you that when Dani was talking, it really made me think of something about how much of people's fate turns on an instant, and that happens time and time and time again. You have people in this particular tragedy are judged and sometimes villainized. A villain becomes villain for the rest of their life based on the decision that's made in a split second. So I think about what Dani was saying about Sky, and some stranger just happened to say, hey, basically come with me if you want to live. And in this particular fire, the people, of course, who ran in and died saving others, but others, I mean, there's a woman who I'm sorry, the book starts off with the decision about a cross, a necklace that a person wears for good luck, and they get to the club and they don't have it on. And they live close by, and they're like, I should just go back and get the cross. I never go anywhere without the cross. I'm gonna go get the cross. And then they decide, I don't need the cross. Well, you can probably guess what happens with that person. If that person had gone home and gotten their good luck cross, they would be alive today to talk about the fire that they saw when they came back. So that's how it is. Fate turns on an instant, and people are judged sometimes for eternity based on some decision they made in a moment. And that really sticks with you, how it was like that in this fire. And I'm sure it was the same in your case.
Yeah, that's really sobering. That reminds me of the ghost ship fire. You know, same thing. People turn right or turn left, and they died or they survived, depending on a split-second decision. So, so another question from a member in the audience had to do with censorship. Did at any point the story you were telling, was it censored, questioned, or edited more than required? And were you able to convey the truth of perspectives in totality? Both the books deal with people who are still living, which makes things a little bit more complicated. Were you able to write about what you wanted, or did you have to pull back in certain times because of worry about, you know, libeling someone or revealing something that was too personal that would be hurtful?
Well, I can share something that basically when I got down towards, in the last year of my reporting, I was threatened with a lawsuit to not report something in the book, threatened with legal action to try to kind of mess with the publication of the book. And that section is still very much in the book. So I heard what the person had to say. I took their side of the story, but no, I was not going to not publish something because somebody didn't like it. So that did still happen. But I did think it was fascinating that someone tried to kind of screw up or mess with the publication of the book. It kind of amazed me, to be honest.
And Dani and Alastair, how about you? Were there things you didn't include for any reason, any particular reason?
There were a few things that came up like that. You know, we spent a lot of time talking with the individuals in the book, hours and hours, many phone calls, many meetings. And during that time, you know, these are people who are dealing with a lot of trauma. There were some minor things revealed that weren't particularly relevant to the story. Maybe the particular sort of addiction someone had struggled with, little details like that that weren't entirely necessary to the story. You know, when I had a chance to review it with certain people I'd interviewed, I decided, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more vague there, perhaps not get into that. But they were all relatively minor, I would say. I think the biggest thing we struggled with was not you know, censoring in any way. It was really just our struggle to get any response from PG&E. To this day, we've never gotten anything from PG&E about our book. We tried to reach out to them numerous ways, and we ultimately were, you know, unsuccessful. They ignored every request, which is quite unusual because if you ever deal with PG&E as a reporter, they are generally very responsive, I found, when it comes to news stories and that sort of thing. So that was quite shocking. And what we had to do to kind of work around that, which was really important, was just talking to actual PG&E workers, you know, talking to the linemen who inspect, you know, the power lines, like where this fire started.
So can you tell us what's happening with Paradise now? I mean, I know that I was just reading about the Kofi fire, the Tubbs fire, that was 2017. People are starting to rebuild. Are people going back to Paradise to rebuild? Give us a snapshot of what's happening in that town.
Sure. So people are going back to Paradise to some extent. The population estimate is a little bit iffy, and they won't really know until the census is out, but you have maybe 3,000 people there, which is about 10% of the people who were there before. Some of them are the lucky ones whose home survived, but it depends on your definition of lucky. If you have a home that survived in a town that's largely destroyed, you have people whose homes have been rebuilt. They've rebuilt a few hundred homes there, and other people who are still, you know, really struggling. They're basically camping out on their burned out lots. What we've ultimately seen is that most people have stayed in Butte County. Some have left the state, but most people stayed near Paradise, and they're just trying to figure out, you know, where do you go from there? You have people who've struggled with homelessness, you know, all sorts of really, really difficult problems following this fire. And I think kind of the consensus about Paradise is that Paradise will come back. It will be a town. It will probably not be a town quite like it was before. This will be a smaller place, but perhaps a more modern place. You know, Paradise had a septic system before, didn't have a sewer system, and so now they'll have that, and undergrounded power lines, that sort of thing. So there will be some kind of Paradise.
So are you continuing to write in The Guardian follow-up stories about Paradise?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're pretty regularly for just kind of documenting the town's recovery and how they're dealing with the fact that another massive wildfire just killed 15 people just down the road.
Okay, so our time has come up, come to an end. I want to thank everyone. Scott, I want you guys to say the name of your book, and Scott, tell us the pub date and where your next appearance is to start out.
The name of the book is Trial by Fire, and it is going to be released on October 27th, so that's only 6 days from now. And actually, I had a friend who was able to buy a copy of it in Corte Madera yesterday. So it's apparently already out there being sold.
Great. Well, congratulations. And Dani and Alastair, tell us the name of your book. And are you guys still doing, I mean, you live on 2 different coasts. That's not so easy. So, but how are you, engaging with audiences right now?
So our book is Fire in Paradise, an American Tragedy. And I lived in San Francisco for 10 years and I just moved to New York, as you said. So it's been, even if there wasn't COVID, it would have been hard for us to do events. But we've done a lot of readings, a lot of interviews. And, if anyone on this call wants to have a sort of book club or anything like that, we'd be delighted to join. And you can get the book through our website, which is fireinparadisebook.com.
Great. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to put in another plug for Litquake and ask people, to consider making a donation through Venmo, through our website, through PayPal. Litquake, like many arts organizations, is struggling, and this is the 21st year of putting on a festival. I think every year it's fantastic and interesting. I think this panel has been really, really good. So if you want to see more things like this, please consider contributing to Litquake. So Dani, Alastair, and Scott, and Julie, thank you so much for your time. And have a good evening.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Litquake. Thank you, Julie.